Put that package down. That's mine. Ma'am, this is literally my porch, liar. I saw you stealing it. And just like that, my Sunday morning coffee turned into a full-blown neighborhood showdown. Yeah, that's Karen, the self-proclaimed HOA security captain, screaming about her packages that somehow always go missing, right before showing up in her garage on camera. Smash that like button if you've ever dealt with a nosy neighbor who thinks every cardboard box belongs to them. Subscribe for more stories of karma with tracking numbers, because this time, the delivery came with venom literally. Get comfy, because this HOA Karen was about to learn what happens when porch piracy meets reptile revenge. When I first moved into Maplewood Ridge, I thought I'd found peace. It was the kind of neighborhood where everyone waved, lawns were perfectly trimmed, and the air smelled faintly of grilled perfection every weekend. For a while, it felt like the American dream in a cul-de-sac. But that dream started to crumble the moment my packages began disappearing one by one. It started small. A set of hiking boots vanished from my porch a few days after delivery, then a Bluetooth speaker, then a month later, my drone. At first, I figured porch piracy was just one of those unlucky things that happens in every neighborhood. Maybe some random thief was driving around looking for easy pickings. I installed a camera above the door, thinking that would be the end of it. I even left a note for my delivery driver, asking him to tuck boxes behind the potted plants by the railing. It didn't make a difference. The packages kept disappearing like clockwork, and I started to feel like I was living in a bad magic trick where the punchline was always my missing mail. I remember one morning, standing on the porch with a cup of coffee, staring at the space where a box should have been. My latest delivery was gone, and I felt that slow boil of irritation rising in my chest. I checked my camera footage, ready to see some random hooded figure creeping around at midnight. Instead, what I saw made me choke on my coffee. It wasn't a stranger at all, it was Karen, the HOA vice president. The same woman who smiled at me every morning when she walked her golden retriever, who baked cookies for the holiday potluck, who bragged about keeping the community safe and orderly. There she was, bright and early, crossing my lawn in a floral robe and fuzzy slippers, bending down to scoop up my Amazon package like she was collecting the morning paper. She didn't even sneak. She looked around once, nodded with self-approval, and strutted off toward her driveway with the confidence of someone performing a civic duty. The strangest part? She actually smiled at my camera before leaving, like she knew she was on film and wanted to make sure I caught her good side. At first I thought maybe there'd been a mix-up. Maybe she grabbed it by mistake, thinking it was hers. That idea lasted about 10 seconds until I checked the next few days of footage. Every delivery I received that week vanished within an hour, and every single time there was Karen, same robe, same slippers, same smug little smile. She had turned package theft into her morning routine. I started to realize this wasn't random theft, it was ritual, a performance of control dressed up as civic duty. The more I thought about it, the more everything clicked. She'd been giving me warnings about community regulations since the first week I moved in. She'd complained about my porch lights being too warm in tone, and said my mailbox didn't match the HOA's preferred black gloss finish. She treated the neighborhood like her personal fiefdom, enforcing imaginary rules that no one but her recognized. And now, apparently, she decided that even my mail was subject to her approval. That week, I tried confronting her gently. I walked across the street, camera, screenshots in hand, planning to have a reasonable adult conversation. She was trimming her hedges, wearing sunglasses like a celebrity, avoiding paparazzi. When I asked if she'd seen any suspicious activity lately, she didn't flinch. She looked me dead in the eye and said, "You can't be too careful. People are ordering all sorts of dangerous things online these days. Sometimes, as community leaders, we have to intervene before someone gets hurt." The way she said it chilled me. She genuinely believed she was doing something noble, like she was protecting the neighborhood from my suspicious Amazon orders. That's when I realized I wasn't dealing with a petty thief. I was dealing with someone who had built an entire delusional universe where she was judge, jury, and porch pirate executioner. That night, I sat in the living room, staring at the footage again, watching her collect my boxes one after another. It was surreal, like watching a nature documentary where the predator strutted proudly after every kill. The neighborhood looked calm and peaceful in the background, but I could feel something sinister beneath that suburban perfection. Every smile from her across the street, Every wave, every polite nod suddenly felt like part of a performance. She didn't see me as a neighbor. She saw me as a problem that needed managing, a rule breaker who didn't appreciate her authority, and I knew right then that it wasn't going to stop. Karen wasn't just taking my packages. She was testing me, seeing how far she could push before I pushed back. And somewhere deep down, I think she wanted me to fight back because in her mind, this was more than theft. It was a game, and she was playing for power. A few days after I discovered Karen's porch piracy operation, I woke up to the sound of paper fluttering against my front door. When I stepped outside, half asleep and still in my slippers, I found a bright yellow envelope taped across the glass like some kind of official warning. In bold letters, it read, "Notice of violation." My first thought was that it must be junk mail or some city formality about recycling schedules. Then I saw the letterhead at the top, Maplewood Ridge Homeowners Compliance Division. The thing is, there was no such department. I'd read the HOA bylaws when I bought the house. Still, the envelope was printed in formal fonts and had a little HOA logo that looked authentic enough to trick someone who didn't pay attention. Inside was a typed letter accusing me of unapproved deliveries, property endangerment, and potential mail misuse. It said I was being fined $200 for violating community security guidelines and instructed me to make the payment to Neighborhood Oversight Committee within 10 days. The wording was serious enough to sound legitimate, but vague enough to make no sense. What did unapproved deliveries even mean? Did the HOA expect me to notify them every time I ordered toothpaste? I read the letter twice and laughed at first, thinking it had to be a prank. Then I noticed the signature at the bottom, Karen Wilkins, Vice President, Maplewood Ridge, HOA. The same woman who'd been stealing my packages had now appointed herself as the neighborhood's postal police. I decided to walk over and ask her about it, hoping to settle things quietly before it spiraled into something worse. She was out in her driveway again, wearing her signature robe and slippers, watering her flower beds like she didn't have a care in the world. I held up the paper and asked what this was supposed to be. She didn't even look embarrassed. Instead, she smiled that smug little smile she always wore when she thought she was teaching someone a lesson. "Oh, that's just a standard notice," she said sweetly. "We've had concerns about the type of deliveries being made to your address. As community officers, it's our duty to ensure safety." I asked what kind of deliveries could possibly be unsafe. She straightened her back like a general preparing for a speech. "You'd be surprised how many people order chemicals, tools, or even weapons online. We can't risk dangerous materials entering the neighborhood." She said it like she was quoting some handbook only she had access to. When I pointed out that she had no legal right to intercept or fine anyone, her expression shifted from calm to defensive. "I'm only doing what's necessary to protect our standards," she said, her voice rising slightly. "If you have nothing to hide, you shouldn't be so upset." That sentence echoed in my head long after I walked away. If you have nothing to hide. It was the kind of logic that turned regular people into tyrants. In Karen's world, privacy was suspicious, and boundaries were just obstacles between her and control. Over the next few days, more letters appeared on my door. One accused me of failure to maintain acceptable visual harmony. Another fined me for inconsistent porch decor, which apparently referred to my choice of doormat. The last one accused me of delivery non-compliance. I kept each letter, documenting every absurd claim. The language became increasingly theatrical, filled with phrases like, "for the preservation of community dignity," and "as authorized by the Maplewood Ridge Executive Committee." It was like she was building her own miniature government out of printer paper and paranoia. One morning, as I was leaving for work, I caught her in the act. She was crouched by my mailbox, slipping another yellow envelope inside, muttering to herself about procedure and standards. When I called her name, she jumped and pretended to be checking her mail. I told her to stop leaving these fake notices and warned her that I would report her to the real HOA board. She crossed her arms, tilted her head, and said, "You can't report me, I am the board." Then she turned and walked away, like she'd just delivered a closing argument in her own courtroom. I spent that afternoon calling every contact listed in the HOA welcome packet until I reached the actual president, a man named Leonard, who sounded exhausted the moment I mentioned Karen's name. He apologized immediately and assured me that none of the letters were legitimate. Apparently, Karen had been reprimanded before for overstepping her role, but she always claimed her actions were community outreach experiments. He said they'd issue her another formal warning, but the tone in his voice told me he didn't expect it to do much. That evening, I found her standing at the end of her driveway watching me. She had her arms folded, a clipboard tucked under one elbow, and a satisfied little smirk, like a chess player who thought she'd trapped me. I realized then that this wasn't about fines or fake authority. It was about power. Every fake notice, every absurd accusation, was her way of testing how much control she could exert over me. She wanted to see if I'd flinch, if I'd follow her made-up rules. And the more I resisted, the more determined she became. I went to bed that night, staring at the stack of counterfeit letters on my kitchen counter, each one more ridiculous than the last, and I understood something important. This wasn't random harassment. It was escalation. She wasn't trying to warn me anymore. She was building a case, a narrative where I was the villain, disturbing her perfect little world. And if I didn't find a way to fight back soon, I knew she'd find new ways to tighten her grip. By the end of that week, I realized Karen wasn't going to stop. The fake notices had turned into a ritual, a kind of morning theater she performed for herself and anyone unlucky enough to watch. I'd wake up to the sound of tape being peeled, open my front door, and find another warning flapping against the glass like a taunt. I had started collecting them in a shoebox, mostly to remind myself that this was really happening and that I wasn't losing my mind. But every time I added another letter, the box felt heavier. It wasn't about paper anymore. It was about control, and Karen was winning. That Saturday morning, while sipping coffee and scrolling through my emails, I caught sight of her from my living room window. She was pacing across her driveway in slippers, talking animatedly on the phone, her other hand waving a clipboard. Every few seconds, she'd glance toward my porch, her lips curling into that self-satisfied smile that had started haunting my dreams. Something inside me snapped. I wasn't going to keep living like this, waiting for the next absurd violation to appear. I wanted her to feel the same unease she'd been feeding me for weeks. That's when the idea struck. It started as a joke in my head, something ridiculous that made me laugh out loud. If she wanted to play neighborhood cop, then I'd give her a case she'd never forget. I started brainstorming ways to make her confront her own obsession without actually breaking any laws. The trick was to outsmart her without stooping to her level, so I ordered a few supplies that same day. A plain cardboard box, some rubber snakes from a prank store, a small Bluetooth camera, and a bottle of reptile scent oil that promised realistic authenticity. When the items arrived, I assembled everything carefully, treating it like a science project. The snakes were coiled perfectly, the scent added just enough realism, and the camera nestled inside, ready to record. Then came the finishing touch. I printed a fake shipping label that read, "Confidential, HOA legal evidence, do not open." I knew Karen's curiosity was stronger than her sense of self-preservation. If she believed the package contained something secret or important, she'd take it. I set it neatly on the porch early the next morning, right in the middle of her morning patrol route. From my front window, I watched her approach. She hesitated at the edge of my property, squinting at the box like it was daring her to touch it. I could see the conflict on her face, that mix of authority and temptation. She pulled out her phone, likely live streaming to her small army of Facebook followers, and started narrating in that shrill voice that carried across the cul-de-sac. "We've received reports of suspicious activity at number 23 Maplewood, possible evidence tampering." Her words were smooth, rehearsed, the tone of someone who believed their fantasy completely. She stepped closer, holding her phone in one hand and tugging her robe tighter with the other. Then, with exaggerated caution, she bent down and lifted the box. The moment it tilted, one of the rubber snakes slipped out through the gap. It fell against her wrist, lifeless but startling enough to trigger a scream so loud I could feel it in my chest. She dropped the box immediately, stumbling backward, waving her arms like she was on fire. The lid popped open as it hit the driveway, and a cluster of fake snakes spilled out, bouncing and rolling toward her feet. Her scream turned into a high-pitched wail as she tripped over her own slippers and fell backward into her flower bed. I was laughing before I could stop myself, the sound bubbling up uncontrollably. The camera captured everything, from her shrieking to the way she yelled into her phone that she had uncovered a biological threat. Neighbors peeked out of their windows, one or two even coming outside to see what the commotion was about. Karen was hysterical, waving her arms and shouting that she had discovered a snake smuggling operation. The rubber snakes glistened in the sun, utterly harmless and completely ridiculous. When she realized I was standing on my porch, filming the scene with my own phone, her face flushed with fury. She scrambled to her feet, brushing dirt off her robe, and screamed that I had set a trap for her. I told her I didn't know what she was talking about, and asked why she was stealing evidence meant for the HOA. That only made her angrier. She stomped across the street, yelling about calling the police. Within 30 minutes, 2 officers showed up. They looked more amused than concerned, as Karen launched into her dramatic retelling of events, complete with wild hand gestures and claims of biohazard materials. When the officers finally inspected the box, one of them picked up a rubber snake and sighed. "Ma'am," he said, trying not to laugh, "these are toys." She refused to accept it, insisting they test them for toxins. The officers exchanged a look that said they'd seen this movie before. After a brief conversation, they left with a warning for her to stop trespassing on my property. As their patrol car disappeared around the corner, Karen stood in her driveway, red-faced and trembling with rage. She pointed a shaking finger at me and said, "You'll regret this." Then she turned and stormed into her house, slamming the door behind her so hard it rattled my windows. I picked up the snakes from her driveway one by one, still chuckling, and placed them back into the box. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the quiet street. For the first time in weeks, the air felt lighter. I knew this wasn't over. People like Karen didn't just give up. But for that brief moment, I felt something I hadn't felt since she'd started her campaign against me: control. And it felt better than revenge ever could. The next morning began with a calm so complete that I almost believed the chaos had finally ended. For the first time in weeks, no fake notice was taped to my door, no rustling came from the bushes, and no shrill voice echoed across the street. The neighborhood felt peaceful again, the way it had before Karen decided to crown herself Queen of Maplewood Ridge. I made coffee, opened the blinds, and watched the sunlight stretch across the quiet lawns. For a few blissful minutes, I allowed myself to imagine that maybe the snake incident had shocked her into retreat. But peace, I've learned, is often just the pause between storms. Around noon, my phone began buzzing nonstop. Notifications, texts, and social media tags poured in like a digital flood. At first, I thought it was a mistake. Then I opened one of the messages and saw it, a link to a video. Karen's video. She had uploaded the entire snake fiasco to her Facebook page with the title, "Neighborhood Terrorism in Maplewood Ridge." In it, she narrated the footage like a documentary, describing me as a dangerous and unstable individual conducting biological experiments. The part where she screamed and fell into her flower bed had been cut, replaced with slow-motion clips of her bravely investigating suspicious materials. The comments were a mix of disbelief and mockery, but a few of her loyal followers, mostly fellow self-appointed HOA heroes, rallied behind her story. Within hours, the video spread across local community groups, turning my neighborhood into the most talked-about circus in town. I wasn't angry. At first, I was almost impressed by how quickly she had twisted the story. She didn't see humiliation, she saw an opportunity. But what she didn't know was that my camera had recorded everything too, and my footage told a very different story. I spent the afternoon compiling clips from my front door, camera and my phone, the full, unedited truth showing Karen trespassing, stealing the box, and screaming when the fake snake spilled out. When I uploaded my version, I didn't need to add commentary. The footage spoke for itself. Within a few hours, her narrative began to crumble. People started asking why she was on my porch in the first place, why she was live streaming while opening someone else's mail. By nightfall, the comments on her page had turned against her. The HOA board called an emergency meeting 2 days later. I arrived early, expecting the usual awkward silence that followed any mention of Karen's name. Instead, I found nearly every resident in attendance. Even people I'd never met before were whispering about the video, some trying to stifle laughter, others shaking their heads in disbelief. Karen walked in wearing a business suit, her posture stiff, her smile forced. She carried a binder thick enough to choke a paper shredder and looked around like a politician about to give a speech that would save her career. When the meeting started, she launched into her defense. She claimed she had been conducting a safety assessment to protect the neighborhood, that she had reason to believe I was stockpiling hazardous materials. She said she was acting in good faith, fulfilling her civic duty, Every word dripped with rehearsed sincerity. But the board wasn't buying it. The president, Leonard, interrupted her halfway through her speech. He played my video on a projector for everyone to see. The moment she appeared on screen in her robe and slippers, clutching the box and screaming as the snakes tumbled out, the room broke into nervous laughter. Karen's face turned the color of ripe tomatoes. She tried to object, insisting the footage had been edited to misrepresent her intentions, but Leonard didn't let her finish. He announced that her behavior violated multiple community rules, including trespassing, harassment, and misuse of HOA authority. He said the board had voted unanimously to remove her from her position and impose a fine for defamation. The room erupted in quiet murmurs of relief. Some even clapped. It was the first time I had seen Karen speechless. She stood there frozen, staring at the screen, her entire facade cracking like a mask that had been worn too long. I almost felt sorry for her as she gathered her things and stormed out, muttering about conspiracies and injustice. Almost. Later that night, I sat on my porch watching the neighborhood settle back into normalcy. A few neighbors stopped by to chat, offering friendly smiles and apologies for not stepping in sooner. For the first time since I moved in, I felt like I belonged. The air was cool, the crickets were singing, and the lights across the street stayed dark. Karen hadn't left her house since the meeting. I assumed she was hiding, nursing her wounded pride, and planning whatever story she'd tell next. But around midnight, I heard movement outside, the sound of footsteps on gravel. I peered through the blinds and saw her car backing out of the driveway, trunk stuffed with boxes. She drove away without looking back. The next morning, the neighborhood group chat was buzzing with news that she'd officially resigned from the HOA, claiming mental exhaustion. Nobody believed it, of course, but no one questioned it either. People just seemed relieved. For the first time in months, there were no notices, no complaints, no neighborhood drama. The calm felt different this time, quieter, steadier, real. I thought that was the end of it, that she had finally surrendered to the weight of her own schemes. But peace, I was starting to learn, is fragile. It only takes one unexpected delivery to break it all over again. A week passed after Karen's resignation, and for the first time since moving into Maplewood Ridge, I began to feel like I could breathe again. The air seemed lighter, the silence cleaner, and the shadows that used to feel watchful now just felt like shadows. My mornings returned to the simple rhythm I had missed so much. I brewed coffee, listened to the faint hum of sprinklers, and scrolled through the news without bracing myself for another round of community drama. It was almost easy to forget the chaos she had caused. Almost. On a Thursday afternoon, a small cardboard package appeared on my porch. It had no return label, no shipping address, just my name written neatly in looping cursive. I assumed it was a neighbor dropping off something as a thank you. The last HOA meeting had ended with an outpouring of support, and people had been leaving small gifts on my porch ever since. Homemade cookies, thank you notes, a bottle of wine. It didn't seem out of place. I brought the box inside and set it on the counter, meaning to open it after dinner. When I finally peeled back the tape later that night, I found a single folded note resting on top of crumpled tissue paper. The handwriting was elegant, almost old-fashioned, the kind of script that made each word feel deliberate. The note said only, "You think you've won, but this isn't over." Beneath it, nestled in the paper, was one of the rubber snakes from my prank box. I stared at it for a long time, unable to decide whether to laugh or feel uneasy. The absurdity of it made me smile, but the fact that she had gone out of her way to send it told me she wasn't quite finished. The next morning, I saw her house across the street. It was empty. The blinds were drawn, the mailbox stuffed, and the for sale sign that once stood proudly by her driveway was gone. Rumor around the neighborhood was that her husband had finally left, that he'd packed his things and driven off the night before she disappeared. No one knew where she'd gone, and nobody seemed eager to find out. Even the gossip-prone neighbors avoided the topic like it carried bad luck. Days passed, and her absence settled over the neighborhood like a strange kind of quiet. It wasn't peace exactly, more like the silence after a thunderstorm, when everything is still damp and charged. I thought about throwing the snake away, but instead, I placed it on my bookshelf beside the box of fake violation letters she'd left me. It became a kind of trophy, a reminder that some battles are won, not by shouting louder, but by being patient enough to let the truth do the work. Then one evening, as The sun dipped below the rooftops and the sky turned the color of burning embers. I received another package. This one was from the local news station. I opened it to find a small envelope inside with a letter from a producer thanking me for agreeing to the interview about neighborhood disputes. Apparently, someone had pitched them a follow-up story about the HOA snake incident, and they wanted to feature me in a special about viral community moments. I hadn't agreed to anything, but it was obvious who had sent the idea their way. Even from whatever corner of the world she'd retreated to, Karen was still chasing relevance. The news segment aired a week later. It was brief but wildly popular, replaying the footage of her grabbing the decoy box, screaming, and tumbling into her garden. The clip spread far beyond our little town. People online were calling it the perfect karma story. Strangers made jokes about porch pirates, fake snakes, and the dangers of overzealous HOA members. Memes flooded social media, each one more absurd than the last. The whole world was laughing at the woman who had spent her life policing everyone else. At first, I felt vindicated. Watching her antics turned into a punchline felt like justice, but after a while, the laughter started to feel hollow. I kept wondering what had pushed her to be that way, what turned a person so obsessed with control that they couldn't see how ridiculous they'd become. Maybe it was loneliness, or pride, or the kind of unhappiness that needs an enemy to survive. Whatever it was, it had devoured her life and left her empty enough to fight imaginary wars in her own neighborhood. A few months later, the house across the street was sold. The new owners, a young couple with a baby, moved in quietly. They smiled when they saw me, waved from their porch, and kept to themselves. The laughter of their child carried across the street at night, light and unguarded, and for the first time, Maplewood Ridge felt like a community again. Sometimes, when I sit on my porch in the evenings, I still think about Karen. Not with anger, but with the faint curiosity reserved for strange stories that don't make sense even after they're over. Her house has new curtains now, her garden is blooming again, and her name has faded into a kind of local legend. But every time a package arrives on my doorstep, I pause for a moment before picking it up, just long enough to smile at the memory of the day. A box full of rubber snakes taught an HOA tyrant what karma really looks like. And there you have it, proof that karma always ships on time, even if it takes a few snakes to deliver the message. If you've ever dealt with a neighbor who acts like they own your mail, your driveway, or your sanity, just remember, the louder the Karen, the harder the fall. Smash that subscribe button for more stories of suburban justice. Drop a comment with your wildest HOA encounters, and tell me what would you have put in that box. Because in this neighborhood, porch pirates beware. Sometimes, revenge comes with scales, fangs, and a return policy marked no refunds.